What are you good at? What are you bad at? What do you like doing? What don't you like doing? Put it in these 4 quadrants.
I almost feel like you have to work on a legacy system.
Performing at the like top runs of the teams I've worked with, who hasn't got there seems to be a skill as well that great developers have to identify what is a red herring and what is not.
Why, hello everyone. This is another Tech at Scale episode. In this episode, I'm joined with Andre, and we're talking about how to become a better dev. This is the shortened version. We did a live stream, which was over an hour. You could see the entire video on our channel.
Today's topic is becoming a better developer.
Mm-hmm.
And you were just saying that this had been on your mind.
Yeah.
So what were you thinking?
So I had like a shower of thought moment this morning. When I was working where I was at Oracle, we just finished our review cycle. And typically how that culminates is like everyone get together, fill out this very formal self-review, and the managers fill out the review. And then there's a bit of like an informal bit where you get review feedback from your peers and people who you've worked with and stuff like that. And it dawned on me that all the people who were getting promoted for the right reasons, I want to kind of be clear on that, but that they're being promoted and they're not just playing the political game. They're ICs, they're getting promoted, they're getting a lot of respect from their peers and things like that. They were all working with mentors who were 2 or more levels above them. And
this is interesting.
That was something I didn't realize. And I was like, am I just like, is this confirmation bias? Is this just one case? And I thought, I'm like, no, like 3 or 4 of the cases. And then I was like, wait, hold on. All the cases of people who have been mentored by ICs 2 levels above or more have been promoted more rapidly than the people who haven't. And it made me wonder, like, there's a couple of things at play. The one is I think you're getting exposure to the senior devs and they're helping you a lot. But I'm also wondering if you're getting like the no holes barred sort of, I can mentor this person because they're not competing for the same job as me. If they get promoted 1 level up, they're going to be my peer. So I prefer not to do that. But these people, because of the double gap sort of thing, they were cool to get all the guidance they needed. And these people got promoted very quickly compared to many other people, but also learned really, really, really quickly. So that sort of made me realize, like, going forward, I'm going to try that tactic and be like, I need a mentor. However, I want a mentor who's like significantly more senior than me, or at least at the top end of the next scale, and see if that helps me. I could be cargo culting here, where it's like just doing the same stuff, but it seems pretty much in line.
I was gonna say, I think there's some truth to that on the management side of doing like promotions and things like that, because if you are 2 tiers up, you actually understand what your manager is looking for then, because that manager is going to have a budget and constraints based off of what their boss sets. So, my boss is not necessarily looking for always precise things. He's more looking for filling in requirements that his boss has put, like the CTO at the company I'm at. So, if I was 2 levels up at Blue Cat where I am, it would be at the CTO level, and it's very, I don't want to say easier, but you get a lot of insights too to exactly what the company's looking for, like that position then. And I do think there is, like, obviously there's always some level of politics to it. Like, just working 2 levels up and having a mentor there is something that you could put in your promotion packet. Like, whenever I'm putting up one of the people on my team for promotion, I always put a section of like, here's a peer quote saying that this person deserves this promotion. Here is someone who is in like a leadership position or above them or exec position. And if you're already 2 levels up, you're probably at that spot where, well, they're not your peer and you don't report into them. So you can't say that there's bias, like you're trying to promote within your team.
Yep.
Because there's 2 levels up. You can say, oh, this is just a leadership like recommendation. Do you think having a mentor is important? Do you have a mentor?
I don't think I've ever seen anyone performing at the like top runs of the teams I've worked with who hasn't got some kind of mentorship relationship with a senior, whether it be like formal or just like we go surfing together on the weekends, or this is the person who I send PRs to just to have a look at things before they go anywhere else or anything like that. But that's the situation, at least. In terms of me having a mentor, yeah, I had a mentor. Within 6 weeks, I got promoted to team lead, mostly because of this mentor's guidance. And it wasn't any kung fu movie, go to the hill and think about certain things. It was very, very, very practical guidance in the form of, what are you doing right now? What are you good at? What are you bad at? What do you like doing? What don't you like doing? Put it in these 4 quadrants.
I think there's a process to becoming a decision maker in a company. So I think it starts with like really finding something that you can carve out as yours in the code base, because then you get expertise and then you become quote unquote an expert in that. And what happens is the role kind of reverses. If you know some section of the code base like the back of your hand, and you are the person making changes, whether it's from above or coming down to you and you're just executing what's being asked, it's still the fact that you've made those changes. And what's going to happen is someone is going to want to make more changes. And who are they going to come to? Well, the person who knows that code base like the back of their hand and has just made a bunch of changes, typically is the person who's going to be informed. Whether that person makes the decision is a whole other thing, but that's a stepping stone, because it typically means like, oh, I can't make that call, but here's my opinion. Let's go get whoever, super senior guy to come in, or gal, and they're going to sit down, and then you're part of the conversation. And I think there's a way to build that up, but I think people really struggle with that when they join companies.
So that is almost exactly how I got transferred to the US, was taking ownership of a piece of code and eat, sleep, breathe that piece of code. It was, fortunately or unfortunately, a very, it was later described as like the code that fights back actively, because it was just something that had never been intended to be delivered. It was meant to be a POC. Someone was like, let's make this proof of concept, did it, and then they were like, "Ooh, this looks like the component that can handle all this other logic." And
Yep.
the person who put together the POC, instead of saying, "Hold on, that's probably not a good idea," they said, "Yeah, that sounds great. Now you guys can take it and you can run with it." Fast forward 2 years or 3 years, I got to work at like 6 a.m. and went, "This thing is driving me crazy. No one in the other time zones know what's happening. I need to be in a US time zone to help out," because the 5 a.m. and between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., I would almost always get messages with like, "Hey, this is not working out. Can you jump on a Zoom call?" No, I'm sleeping. It's 3 a.m. Like, think a little, but that would happen. And it was almost coincidental, because I had no intention of becoming the official like custodian owner of this code base. I just
Yep.
arrived and was like, this thing looks cool. It's kind of okay. To be very honest with you, now that I'm not at the company, the thing that appealed to me the most was that it was isolated from the rest. I felt like we could make decisions, and the interface was very, very slim. Everything coming in was
Yep.
very, very trivial, but the meaty bits were the implementation. And because of that, I could get exposure to doing stuff, and we slowly made it better and less buggy over time. But having that ownership meant exactly like you said. The second something came up, a conversation about it being fragile or maybe a little bit underperformant, we were included. And those aren't conversations. I learned also, coincidentally, from that management doesn't have a 20-minute sit down about one technical component. They don't even know there's a technical component, often like higher enough up the food chain. It's all bucketed in everything else. So you get an invite, you join a meeting, and they talk about your component for 3 minutes, and then you get 27 minutes of all the other inside information.
Yep.
What's happening? Why is this not happening? What is our plans with this feature that you've never heard of? And you just sit there trying to keep your jaw shut. So that happened a couple of times. And I think, yeah, you're 100% correct that just getting additional exposure because of you being the go-to person for something a little bit impactful can go a long, long, long way. And that you can do. Yeah.
I was going to say that it's like, so you get expertise in some section, right?
Mm-hmm.
So people are going to come ask you about it. So
Mm-hmm.
now you're in conversations instead of being just told from above, like, whoever senior principal, someone shows up and we needed to do blah, and this is my diagram. Implement that. Don't do anything else. And then so now you're at the table, so at least you can propose something. It doesn't mean you'll necessarily make the decision, but at least you're proposing,
Yeah.
and then you build up trust, right? Because now you're bringing something to the table and someone can shut it down, but at
Yep.
least you're, hey, this is my thought process. How we thought about this, versus before it's always this like, here's the design, here's what I expect. Don't try and reinvent the wheel. Just do
Mm-mm.
exactly what I say. I would do it myself, but I don't have the time. I have 20 other things I need to spec out.
Mm-hmm.
And you're basically the little puppet. And then once you gain trust, someone like at some level, you're going to have someone who's above you in turn and say like, this isn't my call to make
Yep.
because I don't know enough about where the code base is anymore. You need to talk to Andre for that.
Yep.
And also you became the decision maker for blah.
It's exactly
Um,
that. Yep. Yep.
and I was going to say something else, which I had written down on some notes is I was going to say that I feel like actually become a better dev, I almost feel like you have to work on a legacy system.
Oh, I think people are gonna hate you for saying that, and they're
I
gonna hate
know,
it.
but
They're gonna hate it more because I totally agree. I absolutely agree with you. To make it, I mean, unless you're like releasing something really groundbreaking, which is unlikely. And okay, so if you get teleported from college with a PhD to be like a domain expert, and they're like, here we go, you just landed, you are the person to deal with this problem, maybe that direction. But for the like 99.99% of us, you have to be trusted to be put on these interesting and exciting projects that are like the new pioneering groundwork that's being developed. And the chances of you
yep.
landing that from the get-go is very small. So to prove yourself, you want to be in a space where things exist and don't exist well, so that you can actually make a difference. Like that. That's
Well,
my thinking.
I was gonna say with the legacy stuff, I was actually thinking it from the approach of I think it's a lot easier to work on greenfield project, like a new
Mm,
project, because you're not constrained by anything. When you go to legacy, the problem becomes all of a sudden you have to come up with a way of adding the functionality that you want or the requirements with the existing constraints.
yeah.
Like of whatever it does, whatever prior decisions. Like you can't always just rip out the code because you're like, I would love to just re-implement this interface, but there's 30 other teams that bank on that working that way, and I can't just break compatibility. Like we're beyond that point. So you
Non-starter,
have to work
exactly.
in this really, and I feel like that's a lot harder
Yeah.
because now you have to find a way of, like I said, meeting the requirements, but within the constraints of the existing stuff. And in order to do that, you have to actually go in and understand everything else and how it works. So I think that is something that makes, I think it accelerates a lot of developers. Like from my own personal experience, a lot of the people who I've worked with that are like just very exceptional at what they do, almost all of them have a story of like, yeah, well, this code is nothing compared to this old legacy, like, and it's always some crazy story where it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, this code was written in like 1987 and no one had touched it in 30 years, and I got assigned to work on this component and blah blah blah.
Yep.
And um because yeah, you learn about patterns that exist that you're not even using really anymore, or you think there's a more modern way of doing it. And then some of the tools, like I can give you an example for me. I worked at a payment processor. It was written by one person, literally
Mhm.
one person, for 13 years. They worked for NASA in embedded systems,
Okay.
so they come from a C and C++ world. And due to like the regulations, they were told like, listen, we're going to use Java because they'll make the auditing a lot more easier because garbage collectors there, you don't have to worry about all this stuff. And they brought a lot of non-Java practices with them. Let me tell you, I have never learned so much or felt like I leveled up more than that job. Like even going in and taking things for granted, like your dependency systems, like Gradle and Maven, where you have a new project, you have that. Except this project's all like make files, and like you can't just introduce Maven and Gradle because of like the whole build process that you don't even know how it works. So you can't just be like add a POM file and there you go. It's like, how does all this even work? Like, oh my god, like, and the worst thing in that scenario was uh, the person got bought out. So I only had like 2 or 3 months to basically absorb 13 years of code, and it wasn't a tiny project. Like it it was just tons of different integrations with different banks. And like the worst thing was this was so old that some of the integration was the banks were doing like you deal with like batch files in the payment world on things that their documentation didn't even have anymore. It was like these unknown flags that you could set. And like
Oh,
I'd send in an email and they'd be like, we actually don't know what that does. Like, that's not even documented like 10 years ago. I'm like, oh yeah, because this was integrated 13 years ago. And they're like, we're not sure. So yeah, I do think working with the legacy systems accelerates it greatly. Like it really, really, really accelerates it.
I totally agree with you. And there's so many things that come with it. Like if you're doing greenfield and you decide, hey, we're going to change the API, everyone's like, okay, that's fine. If you do a legacy system and you propose a new API, there's versioning. The amount of effort required really makes you think like, do I need that or don't I? And then also forces you to read way more than you write. And that's where the
Yep.
magic happens or doesn't happen, depending on the quality. But I mean, yeah, you mentioned that like urban myth sort of situations that come up where it's like, where does this flag come from? It's like, don't mess with that. It's been there. I found out about documentation we had for like 5 years for things that had been removed like 6 years prior. And people were running this with like a minus force flag for certain
Yep.
operations that did nothing. It just so happened to work intermittently, and people believed that the force flag was the. You can imagine the Star Wars jokes that came out of that, but yeah, it was pretty entertaining when those things happen. And yeah, they the result of legacy stuff were
I,
not groundbreaking things.
I was gonna say, I think something that I should have been more precise on what we are going to cover because
Mm.
good is so subjective. I was going to say something that's like, I think really, really underrated that not a lot of people do. Like, I don't even, very few,
Mhm.
is I don't know if you've ever heard of something called like BCA, which is behavioral code analysis.
I have not. Sounds
Okay,
very
there's not
trendy.
not a lot. Not it's not. I wouldn't even say it's trendy. I'd say it's something that's like useful that everyone's goes, yeah, yeah, that's useful. But like, when am I
Mm.
gonna use that? Um, it's uh, I remember this when you were talking about the legacy code and the flag, and
Hmm.
there's certain things like no one touches. And behavioral code analysis, what it is you essentially piggyback on your version control
Hmm.
to know dependencies of like what files depend on which other files.
Hmm.
Like, oh, you change this file. Whenever you change file A, you always change file B. So they're
Okay.
probably coupled,
Uh-huh,
right?
uh-huh.
And some of this you'll get through the IDE, right? Like, oh, okay, I know the object's passed in here. But sometimes you're never going to get that. Like, oh, there's a front end component, right? Like, oh, because when you add a new feature on the back end, the front end's probably going to want to change, like, because you're adding like new JSON stuff out, right? Like your IDE is never going to have a control click on that. Like, oh yeah, when you
Yep.
add the back end response, the front end now needs to do something with that.
Yep.
The other things is if you work at like the really sketchy companies, you know, where you have like very little to no code coverage, you want to know, oh, like what is likely to actually break? What do
Yeah.
like if there's something that hasn't been touched for 13 years, like in my case, you're like, if there is a bug, there's been a bug for 13 years and the impact is so minimal that no one's noticed.
Yep.
Versus, and you can also see that how often do we change the files? You're like, the last time was changed 9 years ago. Like, why? Like, it might not be the right way. It might be using something you don't agree with,
But it works.
but it hasn't been. Yeah, exactly.
That's it.
It works. And versus the thing that you're changing like 3 weeks ago, like 5 times, that's probably where you want to start with your test coverage, because that's likely where you're going to break something. So yeah, that's called. There's a whole book on this. It's called like Behavioral Code Analysis X-ray or something.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think it's underrated. I think people can actually, especially if we're recommending to some extent, like legacy codes is the way to accelerate to become a great dev.
Yep.
Well, there's also things to help you and not hate your life in legacy land.
Yeah.
So,
It's so interesting you say that, because like legacy code is probably the thing that most engineers are least prepared for. That's
and least like.
yes, they least like. But now I'm wondering if it's like if you can survive in legacy code land, does that
I think
mean you're a good engineer because of it, or does it make you a good engineer? Like, it's the
well,
worst part, in my opinion, or can be the worst part of dev, is here's a piece of code someone else wrote. It may or may not be broken. We think we have all the source for you. There may be something we need to change. Good luck. And that becomes a scary space. So is it people become better because it's this really, really hard domain, or is there something there that helps it out?
I
This,
almost
yeah.
feel like as the manager side of me, as like it's almost a red flag when people tell me that they don't like legacy. And obviously there's some bias to it because I
Yeah,
kind of do like it.
yeah.
Um, it's because of what I said. It's like, or what at least I'm thinking is people come in and they go, "Oh, that's such garbage. It's such hacks about," and it's not always true.
Mm-mm.
Like sometimes the code that was written was perfectly correct at that time, given the constraints and given where the business was, and then the business evolved and things got built on top of something that originally wasn't built for that. Like, context is so important in these scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
Or, oh, they didn't. Why isn't it running in containers?
Oh, there
And
we go.
well, it's like, listen, this was before Docker existed. So
Yes.
it was before that time. You didn't even get that choice. So like you have to know the context of why the decisions were made at that time. It could have been 100% like the correct choice of technology and everything at that point in time.
Yep.
And they didn't do anything wrong on research or implementation. And then like someone today, after the fact, is like, oh, lol, they're not using blah 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 and all this. And like,
Mm-hmm.
well, yeah, none of that existed. So I do think it somewhat makes it. Like, I don't know if you so much are a great dev if you're attracted towards legacy work,
Yeah.
but I do think it will make a great dev, or it will crush you. And I guess you'll just only want greenfield projects.
Yeah.
And I think that's an easy way out of leveling up. Is you just go, oh, that's all garbage and that's all super hacks. Like, why would I ever want to work in that? And it's the challenge.
Yeah. I think you're definitely onto something there. And it makes me think as well that, like, few people, like you mentioned, people have these like war stories about the legacy stuff they worked on. Maybe people are quiet about going like, I wrote this thing, it was terrible, and starting the conversation that way, opposed to like, I was given this code and it was terrible and this is what happened. But I feel like there's a lot more interesting, a lot more learnings, a lot more stuff. I can for sure say that the stuff that I remember that I'll probably never forget, those bugs that are like once in a lifetime bugs, were fixing things that existed in big code bases in the bits that are not the nice areas to work. Like, it's not the dedicated component that has one responsibility or the other one. It's the GUI bits between it. Like, what are we doing here? How does this component A talk to component B? Why is it not working? A sent what it was meant to. B never got what it was meant to. Who
Yep.
broke it? And that's the stuff that I found made me think differently and a larger scale. And how do you prevent it from happening in the future? So these are the things that legacy code kind of gave me.
Well, that also triggered me to remember that it greatly improves your other tool set, because if it's a what's it, green
I feel,
field,
yeah,
green lit
yeah.
um, project, then you had all the knowledge of being
Mm-hmm.
involved with everything. So you know how it works. It doesn't mean that it was necessarily the simplistic choice and that it isn't complex. It's masked by the fact that you were there during the decision. So you understand the flow of, oh yeah, this object's calling this. And you bring
Yep.
someone else in and they're like, what? Why?
Yeah.
But when you go to legacy, a lot of times there's sections where no one, like there be dragons over here, no one's touched this. All the
Yep.
people who are originally are gone, and the only way you can approach that is you start looking at like fancier tooling. I guess is one way to describe it. Like this is where I really start spending a lot of time with like like trace or
Mm-hmm.
BPF now,
Mm-hmm.
because you're basically like there's so much happening that I need to look at it almost as a black box. And, especially if it's a language you haven't touched before
Yeah.
too, that's like a whole other thing. But when you have like your other toolkit where you're like, ooh, strace, I can at least figure out where the config files are without even needing to know anything of the code, because I can look for the f open on the system calls, or on the BPF stuff. It's like there's some really fancy stuff you can do, like what file descriptors are being opened, what network ports are being opened, what's going where. I can do a lot of the profiling from there, and then like I don't necessarily need to dive 100% into understanding everything. It's like, okay, at least this is a starting point. Like now I know that my focus is in this 10% of classes or whatever it may be, and I'm
Yeah.
going to focus there instead of like originally it's this huge project. You're like, who knows where the bottleneck is? Like,
That's a
and there's perf
yeah.
and all that, but it's like I said, if you haven't used the language before, that's a whole other layer. And anyway.
Yeah. So the thing you mentioned now as well is really interesting, because if you're part of the design of a new project, everything's introduced in this kind of, it's being portioned for you. It's like the whole biting or eating an elephant one bite at a time. The elephant is being served to you one bite at a time. They're like,
Yep.
let's go into a meeting. How are we doing the API? Okay, how are we doing the backend? How are we doing the scheduling? How are we doing all these things? Whereas if you get a legacy project, it's like you're kind of standing at the beach looking at the sea going, it's in there somewhere. And you have no idea of which direction to go and what to do. For me, I found the thing that helped a lot was decide one flow, one logical flow that touched the components I needed for whatever it is I needed to work on, and use whatever tooling, logging, tracing software you needed, or you could get your hands on pretty much,
Yep.
to have this thing go from end to end. Thankfully, with Python, mocking out stuff is basically just like throw something in that it thinks looks right and you're good to go. And you could isolate these different chunks and do that. And doing that gives you the big picture at the same time as the small picture, and you have no choice because you can't isolate things because you don't know what to isolate. So yeah, there's a lot of value there, as much as it sucks.
I think like
I don't know what it is, but there seems to be a skill as well that great developers have to identify what is a red herring and what is not. Like, this makes sense, let's investigate. Like, I've worked with amazing engineers who've pointed out the most obscure things, and I'm like, that can't even be possible. Like, I don't understand. And as much as I didn't want to believe it, it was right. They were like, yeah, this USB device causes random to break in Python. I'm like, what? How did you even know that? And when things like that happen, you're like, I would be a 10x developer in everyone else's eyes if I didn't spend 5 hours working on the wrong thing, and I just like miraculously read the wind and was like, yes, that is what it is. It's a USB device. So yeah, and I think those people don't even know what the secret recipe is. They've just done it for a long time and identified things and being like, yeah, I know exactly what this is. Like, I know exactly what that is.
I was gonna say though, but some of it I think is low-hanging fruit that not a lot of people spend the time figuring out. Like Google Kung Fu. It's like it's not crazy to be really effective with it, but a lot of people don't know some very basic things to narrow down your search. Like the amount of times I've found things on just like small keywords and then being like, oh, site:/github.com will like narrow the search only to github.com. And I know that I'm going to find someone with a GitHub issue related to X line of code. So I know like if anyone's ever had this issue, it's going to come up there. And like people just like Google out some obscure thing like of like, why doesn't jar X work with jar Y? And it's like, that's not how search works. Other thing is making sure when you have your process of troubleshooting that you eliminate whatever it is related to that before trying to like mix and match. Like a lot of times I'll see people Google something, oh, Stack Overflow says block, copy, paste. No, that didn't work. And then they'll, instead of reverting, they'll proceed forward. And the thing is they might actually find the solution that fixes their original problem, but they've introduced a secondary problem and they don't even realize this. So they'll undo all their changes, go back to the start. It's like, actually, no, you have solved it. And the worst is when people are like, oh, no, I've already tried that. That didn't work. No, it did work, but you had introduced a secondary problem when you just kept like not isolating your changes. You know, you're mixing and matching different problems. You're going down the rabbit hole of like, I thought it was DNS. Well, it's not DNS, but I'm going to leave all the stuff I already did, and now I think it's blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no.
Yeah. You cannot be a good dev if you are not in a safe environment. And I don't mean that from like a you're going to be fired situation. It's like, I want to know when I click run, this thing isn't going to do weird like production stuff, because
Yeah.
I can't be trusting of myself to be like that, because then I'll be that dev who's like, we have like 3 espressos, get to like maximum awareness for 2 hours, and that is my code block. Anything beyond that is just too scary, or like something's going to go wrong. But you need that safety net, and tooling could have been made there. The person could have stuck it in a Docker container. The best single dev that I've ever worked with took the entire stack end to end, put it on his laptop, and somehow through combinations of like network level stubbing, through like local databases that were giving false information about how much resources were there and all sorts of things, this thing worked. And what that allowed him to do was do anything he wanted with zero risk. He would literally, you could turn off Wi-Fi and this thing would work for like a cloud environment. And that allows incredibly fast turnaround. You can experiment, you can play in safety. So yeah, that's got to be a factor. Like, either set up the environment yourself or get yourself into a place where your tools do what you do, or help you do what you do better. But not everyone can get that.
Making a great dev is like that curiosity, I guess, is what this is the underlying thing. It's like you need to be able to find something that you find intriguing to push you forward to continue learning. And it doesn't, I don't think it always has to be just necessarily technical, like raw coding. Like it's such a broad thing. Like there's a lot of times I've leveraged non-coding things and leveraged more like the infrastructure side of things to eliminate problems that I know. Like what I was just talking about, all the DNS stuff is not necessarily like, oh, code, right? Like okay, it's related to computer and like all that system networking, but there have been a lot of times like S-Trace stuff came from more my DevOps experience of debugging production when I didn't know the language because I didn't write the code. Someone else deployed it, and now I'm managing it. But now I'm able to bring that back and debugging and in my normal development, or another teammate comes in. Hey, I have this random bug where sockets just closed and I don't know why, and I can't track it down. It's like, well, let's just pull up all the system calls and see what's getting called, when and where. And
so
yeah, anyways, I know we're on time, so
cool. Curiosity, that's probably the biggest thing that might summarize a bunch of the points we've mentioned. Because I know I used to ask people during interviews, tell me what your favorite data structure was. And I had no interest. The answer was never wrong. It was what your justification for it was. And that was always interesting to me. Some people trying to flex with like arbitrary, like I use a Bloom filter because my statistics class taught me that. I'm like, okay, cool. I'm not going to be able to understand what you're reading or writing about. So that's going to be hard. And then some people are like, an int. I'm like, what now? I think you've misinterpreted the question. But yeah, curiosity and just applying themselves in the right space. But yeah, this is a super complex topic. I think if you can distill it and figure out what the checklist is to be a great developer, it would be a very, very, very popular read for a lot of people.
Hey, don't forget to click the thumbs up button and click the bell for notifications. Subscribe. Smash the like button. Smash the subscribe button. Smash the bell notification. Smash all things. This is Tech at Scale. I'm your host, Corey Darby, and until next week,